I used to think death was just another form of content, a headline, a hook, a reason to make someone's thumb stop just long enough for the ad impressions to count. I wasn't a monster, not in the way people imagine, just a journalist who learned that tragedy paid better when it rhymed, when it hurt beautifully. When a family's worst night became a metaphor I could polish until strangers whispered, "God, how awful," and clicked again. For years, I wrote the United Kingdom's most viral obituary column, though no one called it that. Human interest reporting, they said. Suicide awareness coverage, they said. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was carving poetry from corpses. I didn't expect my brother to become breaking news. I didn't expect my own words to greet me when I saw his face on the homepage. And I didn't expect the silence that followed, a silence so heavy it scraped the ambition straight out of me. This is the story I never meant to write, and the last one I ever will. I didn't plan on becoming the kind of reporter who waited for bodies. Back then, I thought I was going to be a writer, the kind who crafted novels in cafes, underlining metaphors in cheap paperbacks, and pretending the world made sense if you described it well enough. But London has a way of turning dreams into invoices, and rent doesn't care about literary ambition. So I took the first newsroom job that would have me, junior reporter, human interest desk, 5 a.m. rota. I learned quickly that human interest didn't mean what the name implied. It meant find the tragedy before anyone else does. It meant write it fast, write it sharp, write it so people click before their tea cools. I wasn't the only one doing it, but I was the one who took it the farthest. My editor, Garrett, was the kind of man who believed the world existed in headlines. He used to slap a stack of printouts onto my desk and mutter, "Tighter, bloodier, needs rhythm." He didn't mean it literally, not at first. He meant emotional blood, narrative blood, the kind people can smell through a screen. And I delivered. God, I delivered. There was something intoxicating about the way the words came to me, too easily in hindsight. I could take the barest outline of a life, a sentence from a police report, a quote from a neighbor who barely remembered the deceased, and sculpt it into something that felt cinematic. I told myself it was empathy, journalism with poetry, a service to the public conversation around mental health. But the truth was simpler. I liked being good at something. Finally. Dangerously. Ambition is a quiet virus, the kind you don't notice until it's colonized your bloodstream. Mine sounded like applause written in analytics, click-through rates, comments, DM requests from strangers saying, "No one writes pain like you. No one should write pain like me." And I should have known that. In the beginning, I still had rules, moral little speed bumps I placed in front of myself to pretend I wasn't accelerating towards something darker. I wouldn't interview minors. I wouldn't request family photos. I wouldn't publish anything before double-checking with loved ones. I broke each rule the second it became inconvenient. I remember the first time I ignored a family's request for privacy. A university student had jumped from a bridge. No note, no warning, no gentle explanation. Just absence where a body should have been. The parents begged the press to leave them alone. Every respectable outlet did. I didn't. My piece went live at dawn. By noon, Garrett was standing over my desk with 2 coffees and a grin. "Jesus Christ, mate," he said. "You write like death owes you a favor." I laughed. Worse, I felt proud. That pride became my identity in the newsroom. Reporters doing political coverage or economic analysis would nod at me with cautious respect, like I was the man who walked into the burning building and came out with the perfect quote. They didn't ask how the job was affecting me. I didn't ask myself either. I told people I didn't get attached, that writing about suicide every week didn't change the temperature inside my chest, that I could draw this clean line between craft and conscience and nothing would cross it. I lied without realizing it. The first crack appeared the night a grieving mother told me on the phone, voice shaking, "Please don't turn my son into whatever headline you need." Her words hit me harder than any editor's critique, not because they changed my choices, they didn't, but because they revealed how hollow my excuses really were. I still published the story. I still slept that night. And that was the moment I should have understood I was slipping. Newsrooms normalize extraordinary things, crying in the stairwell, taking calls from hospitals like you're scheduling salon appointments, turning grief into content with the detachment of a surgeon and the speed of a thief. I told myself it was necessity, survival in a collapsing industry. Every journalist knows the pressure. Be faster, be sharper, be unignorable. And when your niche becomes tragedy, you cling to it like a lifeline, even when it burns you. But the real reason I stayed? Fame. A small, tightly contained sort of fame, but fame nonetheless. People followed my work. They quoted it. They analyzed it. Online forums dissected my turns of phrase like I was some morbid poet laureate for the broken. I didn't see the problem because the praise drowned out the warnings. Garrett's approvals, readers' obsession with my lyrical sorrow, my growing addiction to being the first voice speaking over someone else's final silence. In Act 1 of any downfall, the protagonist always tells you they didn't know what they were becoming. But I did. I just didn't care. Not until the day the newsroom fell silent. Not until the monitors filled with a headline I didn't write, but recognized instantly. Not until I saw my brother's name. But that belongs to the next act. If Act 1 of my life was about becoming the journalist I swore I'd never be, then Act 2 was about learning how temptation doesn't always arrive wearing sequins or with a devil's grin. Sometimes it shows up as a promotion, a compliment, a moment of relief in a year that's been grinding you into dust. Temptation doesn't seduce you, it reassures you. That's how it wins. I didn't start out wanting fame. I wanted security, the childish, impossible idea that if I worked hard enough, the world would stop trembling beneath my feet. Growing up, money was a ghost we kept trying to catch. My mom cleaned houses. My dad repaired cars until the garage shut down. My brother Jamie and I learned early that bills had a louder voice than any bedtime story. So when I discovered that tragedy, other people's tragedy, could pay my rent and buy me time and make editors look at me like I was indispensable, something inside me clicked. A small, bright, terrifying spark. A voice that whispered, "Finally." I think that's why I leaned so hard into the work. Not because I wanted to exploit anyone, but because I wanted, desperately, to feel like my life wasn't accidental, that I'd built something, that I was wanted for something, even if that something was dark. There was a point, a specific month actually, when everything changed.
When I stopped being just another reporter in a crowded office and became the guy who could make the whole country stop scrolling for one terrible second. It started with a piece I wrote about a musician who'd taken his life. I phrased the headline like a single broken lyric. The story exploded. Not because of the details, they were sparse, but because the tone felt intimate, like a confession someone had accidentally released to the public. My editor sent me a Slack message that morning. "You unlocked something. Do it again." Those 5 words became the cage I built around myself. Every week I chased that high. Not substances, not nightlife, not the cliché descents you see in films. No, my addiction was click-through rate, engagement heat maps, shares so rapid the servers burped and stalled. The algorithms loved me. My stories climbed traffic charts like ivy on a forgotten building. And the more the numbers rose, the more the newsroom leaned toward me. With respect, yes, but also something like fear. This is where fate gets tricky. Nobody tells you where the ethical line is. It's not painted on the floor. It's not taped to your monitor. You only know you've crossed it when you look back and realize it's so far behind you, it might as well belong to someone else. My first significant raise came wrapped in praise. "You've got a voice," they said. "You're doing important work," they said. "You make people feel seen," they said. No one mentioned the families who emailed begging us to take articles down. No one mentioned the readers who romanticized the pain instead of understanding it. No one mentioned the commenters who wrote, "He captured this tragedy beautifully," as if beauty belonged anywhere near grief. Temptation grew roots inside me. Security became comfort. Comfort became pride. And pride is the one emotion that makes you ignore the smoke before the fire. I began to curate my image, the tragic storyteller, the empathetic observer, the reporter who carried sorrow gently like a relic. I let people believe that persona was real. Part of me believed it too. But ego doesn't enter the room politely. It kicks the door open. And mine walked into the newsroom ahead of me, taking up space I hadn't earned. It's strange to admit it now, but I started hearing my own sentences before I even began writing. The rhythm became predictable, the long beats, the sharp jabs, the way I could turn a life into a cautionary poem without thinking about the person attached to it. I knew which adjectives made people lean closer, which verbs made their stomach drop,
Which narrative arcs guaranteed tears. My craft sharpened into a weapon I pretended was a pen. And people noticed. Suddenly, I was being invited to panels on emotional journalism. Podcasts wanted to interview me. Universities asked me to speak to students about the ethics of storytelling, oblivious to the hypocrisy dripping from every slide I presented. I wasn't proud, but I wasn't ashamed either. I was busy. Busy people don't have time for introspection. That's the thing about ambition. It doesn't feel like climbing a ladder. It feels like running downhill and convincing yourself you're in control. Jamie drifted in and out of my life like weather. Some days he was warm, reachable, laughing about something trivial. Other days he closed up, retreated, told me he was fine in a tone that meant the opposite. We weren't estranged, just busy. Adults who let months pass between calls, both pretending it wasn't a problem. When you spend your days writing about strangers who vanish, you begin believing your own family is immune, as if proximity to tragedy makes you untouchable. I should have noticed the things he wasn't saying, but I was too busy writing about other families' heartbreak to see the cracks in my own. What irony that I could analyze any stranger's grief with surgical precision, but I couldn't see the sorrow in my brother's eyes the last time he visited. He asked me once, jokingly, "Does writing about all that darkness mess with your head?" I shrugged, said something glib, made it sound like a badge of honor. He nodded in that too slow way of someone filing your answer somewhere important. I didn't follow up. I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't realize he was giving me a chance to see him, and I missed it. At some point, I don't know exactly when, I stopped seeing stories as stories. They became opportunities. Each tragedy was a structure waiting for my touch, my craft, my signature. People began referring to my articles by tone rather than by subject. That piece felt like one of his. Classic tragic cadence must be him. I became my style. My style became my success. My success became my justification. It's astonishing how easily a sense of purpose can mutate into a rationalization. I told myself I was sparking awareness, starting conversations, helping readers understand grief. But self-deception is a warm blanket. You never realize how suffocating it is until someone pulls it off you. Garrett praised me constantly. "You're our star," he'd say. "Find me another one, something with weight, depth, emotion." I nodded every time, pretending I didn't feel the hollowness growing inside me, the invisible exchange rate where empathy was the currency I kept spending past zero. There was a particular case, a teacher found in her flat. Quiet life, no prior signs. I interviewed her sister, who spoke with this trembling determination, as if she was trying to anchor her sibling's memory to something real. She wasn't a story, she told me. She was a person. I said I understood. I didn't. Not then. When the piece went live, it blew up. Viral by noon, trending by evening. People retweeted the line about the silence between her last text and the moment her phone went still. Garrett patted my back. Readers praised my sensitivity. Numbers soared. And the sister emailed us at 2 a.m. saying she couldn't sleep because the world was consuming her siblings' final hours like entertainment. That was the first night I felt something shift, a small, sharp guilt. I ignored it, buried it in overtime, but it stayed, waiting. Temptation had already done its job. I needed the validation too much to stop. By the time the breaking news alert arrived, the one with my brother's name, I was fully gone, swallowed by the persona I'd created. A man who crafted sorrow for a living. A man who believed distance equaled safety. Temptation didn't destroy me. It simply blinded me long enough for life to happen without my permission. That day, when the newsroom went silent and every monitor reflected my worst fear, I understood something with perfect, terrible clarity. I had spent years writing about other people's endings, and now my own life had reached a chapter I couldn't edit. But the collapse, the real collapse, belongs to Act 3, and it hits fast. I wish I could say the collapse started with my brother, but the truth is, I'd already been falling for years. Jamie's death wasn't the beginning. It was the moment the ground finally stopped pretending to hold me. Before that, I indulged, fully, shamelessly, the way only someone numb can indulge. Let me take you inside it. There's a particular kind of light in a newsroom after midnight. Too bright, too cold. It makes your skin look a little sick, your eyes a little glassy, your thoughts sharper in the worst way. I lived for that glow. Most people think indulgence means parties, hedonism, whatever cliches you see on streaming dramas. But mine was quieter, smoother, more addictive. The indulgence was the hunt, scrolling emergency reports, refreshing police feeds, scanning community groups for posts that smelled like fresh grief. I told myself I was doing my job, but I wasn't looking for truth. I was looking for a hit, a headline that would trend, a phrase that would land like a stone in the throat of the nation. Something that would make my editor whisper, "This is why we keep you." That whisper was my drug. A single sentence of praise could keep me awake for 36 hours. Indulgence isn't loud, it's gradual. You stop noticing small things first, your own posture, the stiffness in your jaw, the way you start writing about pain with technical ease, like you're solving a crossword. Then you stop noticing bigger things, people, their fragility, their humanity, their boundaries. And at some point, you look at a grieving mother, and all you see is a quote that will pull at the reader's throat. I hate admitting that, but this act is honesty or nothing. There was a night I interviewed a father who kept repeating, "Don't make her sound like a tragedy. She wasn't one." I nodded. I agreed. I promised. But when the story went live, I led with this line. Her laughter used to fill rooms until the day silence chose her instead. Readers adored it. The father didn't speak to me again. Blindness isn't darkness, it's brightness, too much of it. So much that it washes out the human beings sitting right in front of you. High tension, quick cuts, no mercy. I need you to feel the speed. I'd finish a story at 11 p.m. and walk straight into the city. Not to drink, not to flirt, not to escape. To listen. Bars leak stories. Night buses leak confessions. London, at midnight, becomes a net full of sinking lives. I absorbed them. Every overheard argument, every slurred apology, every couple breaking quietly at a bus stop. I collected sorrow like currency. Back then, it felt like inspiration. Now I know it was extraction. I'd take these fragments home, toss them onto the page, and sculpt metaphors around strangers who'd never given consent for their voices to touch my work. That's indulgence, using the world as raw material. Not literal, never literal, just stories. But they stacked up anyway. Faces, timelines, police statements, voicemails, text messages families forwarded to us, trusting we'd handle them with care. Care is expensive. Ambition is cheap. I chose the latter every time. There were nights I wrote 3 obituaries before dawn, nights I skipped funerals because I didn't want to see the real aftermath, nights I closed my laptop and felt nothing. You'd think numbness would frighten me. It didn't. It was thrilling. Numbness meant I could work without breaking. Numbness meant I was efficient. Numbness meant I didn't have to ask why I was the way I was. That's the danger of indulging in your own detachment. The world feels easier when you're not in it. One night, an intern emailed me a leaked message thread. A young man had posted something strange, vague, worrying. Nothing confirmed, just the scent of crisis. The intern wanted guidance. Should we investigate? Should we wait? I didn't wait. I drafted a full piece before the family had even processed what was happening, before the police finished their report, before the truth had a chance to breathe. Garrett published it within the hour. Traffic soared. We beat every outlet in the country. It was a triumph professionally, a milestone. But at the time, I didn't know Jamie followed that young man online. Didn't know they had mutual friends. Didn't know my brother read that article the same night I wrote it. He didn't call me, he didn't message, but he read it. That detail would haunt me later. Haunt is the wrong word. It would break me. But that's Act 3B. For now, we stay in the descent. As my work grew darker, so did my followers. Messages from people who consumed sorrow like wine. Comments from readers who praised my beautiful grief. DMs from young writers asking how to make tragedy sound poetic. Some nights I answered them. Other nights I blocked them for asking questions I didn't want to consider. How do you describe darkness ethically? How do you keep empathy intact? How do you not lose yourself? I didn't know. I didn't care. Instead, I leaned into my persona, the tragic observer, the quiet chronicler of suffering. A role that let me hide everything I didn't want to fix. The attention was intoxicating. It justified everything. That's indulgence's final trick. It makes your worst habits feel like purpose. I remember the exact last night before my life split open. I was in the newsroom, alone, writing another story that wasn't mine to write. The glow of the monitors felt heavenly, synthetic, addictive. My fingers moved faster than my thoughts. The metaphors flowed effortlessly. Too effortlessly. I wasn't thinking about the person, or the family, or the implications. I was thinking about the headline, the impact, the rhythm, the praise. The indulgence had devoured everything else. And then, a notification, a small sound, barely a click. Breaking news, local alert, unconfirmed death. A name, his name, my brother's name. But that's the collapse. That's Act 3B. And collapse always comes with silence. Collapse doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives like recognition. A single instant so sharp it slices everything open. For me, it was a push notification. Just a vibration. A blink on the corner of the screen. A sound the newsroom heard 1,000 times a day. But this one carried a name I'd known my whole life. Jamie Whitlock, 27. My brother. My only brother. The newsroom didn't gasp. They just paused. 3 seconds of stillness. The kind you get when reality steps into the room uninvited. Someone whispered, "Isn't that?" And I knew the rest of the sentence, but I didn't wait for it. I stood up so fast the chair rolled backwards. The room felt bright, blinding, wrong. Garrett walked toward me carefully, like I was a wounded animal he didn't want to startle. He said my name once. Quiet. I didn't respond. I was already moving. I ran. Past the desks, past the glass meeting rooms, past the framed awards I used to admire. It felt like running underwater. Every screen I passed showed the same alert. Different outlets, same phrasing, same rhythm. Not mine. But it could have been. It felt like mine. A headline that sounded like I'd written it in another life. Man found dead in South London. Family notified. No poetry, no metaphor, just the bare violence of fact. I had built a career on dressing tragedy in language, and suddenly all I wanted was for the world to shut up and say nothing at all. When I reached the hospital, the corridors were too white, too silent, too prepared. A nurse looked at me with the kind of compassion that confirms the thing you've been trying not to understand. She didn't say it outright. She didn't have to. I felt myself float behind my own body, a hollow spectator watching a scene he'd written 100 times for other families, never imagining he'd inhabit it. A doctor walked me to a small room. Neutral walls, neutral chairs, neutral tone. The neutrality cut worse than grief. He said words. I heard shapes, not sentences. Time of death, found alone. No evidence of, did everything we could. But there was one sentence, the only one that stuck. Your brother's phone had your number open. Not dialed, not calling, just open. Like he meant to reach out, like he hesitated, like something stopped him. Or like he wondered whether I, the man who wrote sorrow for a living, would even know what to say. That thought fractured me. Grief didn't hit me first. Habit did. The trained reflex of a journalist processing information, cataloging, sequencing, organizing tragedy into narrative order. I hated myself for it, but the instinct was automatic. I thought, what were his last hours like? Did he leave anything behind? What signs did I miss? How would this look in a headline? And the moment that last question formed, even faintly, something inside me tore. I nearly screamed. Not from pain, from revulsion. At myself, at the job, at the world I'd shaped my identity around. My mind had been trained to turn death into language, but not this one, not him. I sat in my car outside the hospital for almost an hour. I scrolled through our last conversation, a string of delayed replies, half-finished jokes, bits of affection squeezed between deadlines. There was one message from him, 3 weeks old. Proud of you, you know, even if your job is nuts. I never answered it. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was always writing about someone else's crisis, always busy, always postponing what actually mattered. Collapse isn't a single blow. It's every tiny neglect returning all at once. When I returned home that night, the emails were already waiting. Subject lines sharp enough to cut skin. Urgent. Need comment from family. Press request for statement. Can you confirm relation to the deceased? Journalists, my peers, doing what I'd done to countless families. I wasn't angry at them. I was angry at myself, because I knew exactly how they were thinking. They weren't cruel. They were on deadline. They were desensitized. They were me. I closed my laptop, turned off my phone, cut the world out with one trembling hand. But you can't cut out your own conscience. The next morning, I woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind, the punitive kind, the kind that presses against your lungs. No notifications, no calls, no messages. Just an empty flat that echoed with all the words I'd used to decorate other people's tragedies. Gone too soon. Unanswered questions. A light extinguished. Loved by many. Every phrase came back like a boomerang. Sharp. Accusatory. My own writing turning into evidence against me. I tried to make coffee, but couldn't swallow. Tried to shower, but couldn't breathe. Tried to think, but everything looped back to one truth. I had spent years romanticizing the very sorrow that was now tearing me apart. Indulgence had stripped me of the ability to face real grief. I returned to work 2 days later, not because I was ready, because I didn't know where else to go. The newsroom fell quiet when I walked in. Sympathetic eyes, awkward pauses, people who didn't know whether to hug me or avoid me. Garrett approached slowly and placed a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to write, he said. Take time. But he didn't understand. Not writing felt like drowning. Writing felt like betrayal. I sat at my desk anyway, opened my laptop, stared at the blinking cursor. It pulsed like a heartbeat. For years, that pulse meant creation. Now it meant accusation. Words wouldn't come. Not because I lacked clarity, because the act of writing itself felt violent. Everything I'd ever done suddenly looked monstrous in the glare of my brother's absence. Collapse isn't just emotional, it's physical. My body felt wrong, too heavy, too slow, as if grief had rewired the gravity around me. I walked home that night without noticing traffic, or weather, or time. I felt hollowed out, not by sorrow, but by understanding. For the first time, I understood what my stories did to people, how my metaphors shaped public imagination, how my phrasing could become a wound. I understood the harm, and harm, once recognized, cannot be unseen. 3 nights after Jamie's death, the article went live. Not mine, another outlet, another writer, but the headline, God. It sounded like me. The cadence, the rhythm, the cruel elegance of it. I read it once, twice, a third time, and something inside me snapped so cleanly it felt surgical. That was it, the final fracture, the absolute end of indulgence. Because I knew, with horrifying clarity, that I had taught the industry to write like that. My style, my methods, my fingerprints in someone else's obituary for my own brother. The collapse wasn't metaphorical, it was total. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk with a blank document open, staring at the place where sentences are born. No metaphors came, no flourishes, no poetic wounds, just one thought. I can't do this anymore, but I have to do something. The next morning, I made my choice. A choice that would end my career and begin something else. But that belongs to Act 4. And Act 4 starts slow, very slow. Confession doesn't begin with words. It begins with quiet. The morning after that final headline, the one that stole my breath and any remaining illusions I had about myself, I woke before dawn. Not because I'd slept. Grief doesn't let you rest. It only lets you stall. The flat was cold, muted, unfamiliar. I sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of my brother. He'd borrowed it a month earlier after staying the night. He spilled tea on it, laughed, called it a small disaster. I'd never washed it after he left. It was the last thing that still held his warmth. I held the fabric like a confession letter, and something inside me softened, then cracked. That crack was the beginning of truth. For years, I wrote about endings, clean arcs, neat metaphors, tragedies trimmed to fit a narrative frame. But when I tried to write Jamie's story, when I sat in front of the blank page and begged the silence around me to loosen its grip, nothing came. No rhythm, no elegance, no instinct, just the raw, unfurnished ache of reality. It turns out you cannot romanticize what you have loved, not when it is gone. I typed his name, just his name, and my hands began to shake so violently I couldn't touch the keyboard again. I closed the laptop and whispered, to no one, to him, to myself, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It wasn't enough, but it was the truth. Confession often arrives disguised as avalanche. My inbox filled again. Not with press inquiries, I'd shut those down, but with messages from readers. People who had followed my work for years. People who had cried at my articles. People who believed, sincerely, that I carried the world's sorrow delicately. They wrote things like, your writing helped me understand my friend's death. Your empathy is rare. You make tragedy feel meaningful. Every line stung. They weren't lying, but they weren't right either. Their praise tasted like something sour, something spoiled, because I knew that if even one person had ever found comfort in my writing, it was by accident, not intention. My intention had always been ambition, attention, impact. And now, seeing those messages, I realized I had become a curator of pain without earning the wisdom that responsibility demanded. I didn't answer any of them. I couldn't. Confession begins with silence because silence is the only place where lies stop echoing. 3 days later, I visited my parents. Their house was smaller than I remembered, quieter, haunted in a way no language can soften. My mother opened the door with a face that had aged 10 years in 3 days. My father stood behind her, a tall shape, folded inward like grief had bent him physically. We didn't greet each other. We collapsed into an embrace that felt like it might fuse us together. When we finally sat down, no one spoke. The living room was filled with remnants of my brother. A mug he'd forgotten, a jacket on the chair, a book he halfway finished. Every object was a confession of its own. My mother broke the quiet first. You write about this all the time, she whispered. But how do you understand it now? The question hit me like a weight dropped onto a fragile bridge. How do you explain to a grieving parent that you don't understand anything? That you spent years crafting stories beautiful enough to distract yourself from the truth? That you traded sincerity for style, depth for performance? I looked at her and said the only honest thing I could. I never understood it. I only described it. She closed her eyes. My father nodded once, a small, pained approval, or maybe resignation. That was the moment I realized confession isn't self-punishment, it's surrender. Western culture teaches us to carry grief alone, to shoulder pain quietly, to keep walking until the wound stops bleeding. But grief doesn't work that way. It never has. Connection, the most human of balm, becomes the thing we forget to reach for when we need it most. And for the first time in years, I reached. I sat with my parents, held their hands, let the silence breathe, listened to stories I had heard 100 times as a child, but never with this kind of reverence. Jamie's first scraped knee, his first suspension from school, his love for taking things apart and putting them back together with fewer screws. We laughed, then cried, then laughed again because the crying was too heavy to carry on its own. Connection, real connection, felt like thawing after a long, arrogant winter. I had spent years describing other people's mourning rituals without ever touching my own. Now I was inside it, and it humbled me. Garrett called a week later. His voice was cautious, as if it feared the truth it was about to meet. "We'll run whatever you want to say," he told me. "A statement, a remembrance, a piece in your own words. The country listens to you." I almost laughed. The country listened to the version of me he'd helped create, the poetic chronicler of tragedy, the man who knew how to turn grief into literary currency. But that version was dead, and I wasn't going to resurrect him. "I'm not writing a story," I told him softly. A pause on his end, a long one. "So what are you going to do?" I stared out my window at the dimming London skyline, a horizon I'd used as a backdrop for countless metaphors, and said, "Tell the truth. Not to the public, not to the industry, not even to my readers, to myself." And the truth was simple. I couldn't write about death anymore without becoming the thing I feared, someone who used pain to fill a void inside himself. Garrett inhaled sharply. "You're quitting." I didn't say it, but the silence said everything for me. The confession wasn't a single conversation. It was a process, slow, raw, tender. I went back to my brother's room, took in the smell of his clothes, ran my fingers across the spine of the book he'd been reading, sat on the edge of the unmade bed. It struck me then. Every person I'd ever written about had a room like this, a space untouched by their absence, a life paused mid-sentence. And I had turned those unfinished sentences into art. That realization hollowed me out. I whispered into the quiet room, "I should have called you. I should have seen you. I should have been your brother, not your biographer." The room didn't answer, but something in me shifted. Confession isn't about forgiveness, it's about clarity. And now, finally, I could see. People imagine confession as catharsis, a release, but real confession leaves you suspended, between who you were and who you might still become. I didn't know what my life would look like without journalism, without the identity I'd built from other people's sorrow, without the false purpose that ambition had wrapped around me like armor. All I knew was this: I couldn't keep writing the way I had, not after losing Jamie, not after understanding the harm. The next step wasn't redemption. Redemption is too neat, too cinematic. The next step was acceptance. But acceptance comes in Act 5, and it begins quietly, very quietly. Return is the smallest word in the story, and the hardest one to live. People think return means going back, to yourself, to routine, to normal life. But after a collapse like mine, return meant something quieter, less heroic, more human. It meant learning how to stand still without reaching for a keyboard as a shield. 2 weeks after Jamie's death, I returned to the newsroom one last time. Not to write, not to apologize, not to explain. To leave. I cleared my desk slowly, not because there was much to take. I'd lived most of my adult life through screens. But because I wanted to feel the weight of the moment. Pens, notebooks, a mug someone once gave me that said, "World's Saddest Poet." I used to find it funny. Now it felt like evidence. Garrett stood by the door, hands in pockets, face tight. "You sure?" he asked quietly. "Yes." "You could come back later." "No." "You were the best we had." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he believed it. Believed in the version of me that could turn grief into gold. But belief doesn't make a man whole. I shook his hand, closed the door behind me, and walked into air that felt different, lighter, heavier, more honest. There is no clean arc to recovery, no elegant metaphor, no satisfying montage. There was only time. Time spent sleeping too much, then not at all. Time spent sitting on my floor, sorting through Jamie's belongings. Time spent listening to my parents breathe on the phone because words were too fragile. I learned to cook again, badly. Learned to walk without needing a destination. Learn the shape of silence when it isn't filled with deadlines. Some days I missed the newsroom, the adrenaline, the rush of creation, the illusion of importance. But every time I felt the itch to write tragedy again, I imagined a stranger writing about Jamie with the same lyrical detachment I once believed was empathy. And the itch dissolved into something like resolve. Grief isn't a punishment. It's a teacher with terrible timing. It taught me that trauma should never be a public spectacle, that a family's worst night shouldn't be anyone's morning headline, that metaphors can wound, that timing matters, consent matters, compassion matters more than elegance. And it taught me that I had been wrong, not evil, not malicious, just wrong, in the way I believed my craft required distance. Distance is cleanliness, but closeness is truth. And the truth was that I never truly saw the people I wrote about, not fully, not with the softness they deserved. Jamie made that clear, brutally, irrevocably. People asked what my next chapter would be. A book, a podcast, a new publication. None of those felt right. Instead, I volunteered. One afternoon, I walked into a small community center in South London, the kind with mismatched chairs and posters curling at the edges, and asked if they needed help. They did. Everyone always does. I made tea, swept floors, listened. That was it. Listening. Not interviewing, not extracting, not mining sorrow for material. Just listening in a way I never had before. One man told me about losing his daughter. A woman shared the story of her best friend. A teenager talked about a classmate he still didn't know how to talk about. I didn't take notes, didn't shape their pain, didn't look for metaphors. I just stayed present. And presence, I learned, is its own kind of redemption. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. Months later, I opened my laptop, not to write a story, but to write honestly. No headline, no audience, no agenda. just a document titled, For Jamie. I wrote about us as children, about biking down hills too fast, about fighting over the remote, about the day he told me I'd be a writer, about the afternoon he spilled tea on my blanket and grinned like it was the funniest mistake ever made. There was no artistry in the writing, no polish, no rhythm, just truth. And for the first time in my life, truth was enough. I didn't return to journalism, not the way I left it, but I returned to something else, myself. The version of me who wanted to write without harming. The version who believed language could comfort rather than exploit. The version who knew that every story belongs first to the people who lived it. I returned to connection, to family, to the quiet understanding that my brother's life mattered more than any piece I ever published. And in that understanding, I found a kind of peace. Not forgiveness, that's a different journey, but acceptance. Acceptance of what I did. Acceptance of what I lost. Acceptance of what remains. People ask if I miss the old work. Sometimes, but I don't miss the person I was inside it. I learned something simple, painfully simple. You cannot polish a wound without cutting yourself open. And I'm done bleeding for admiration, done carving tragedy into poetry, done confusing impact with meaning. Now, when I tell my brother's story, I tell it plainly, without adjectives, without spectacle, without trying to make it beautiful. Grief is not beautiful, but love is. And Jamie had plenty of that. This, here, is my return. Not triumphant, not grand, but steady. And steady is enough.